platforms and what type of content tends to do well there from an angle point of view. The number one thing to remember is that often there are more similarities between platforms than there are differences when it comes to concepts and angles. And so there's no middle ground when it comes to media mix. People are either too ambitious with the amount of platforms that they want to take on, or people are not ambitious enough. I once went from spending no money on this platform to spending $500,000 in a singular month. I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Feel like who, when, where, and what were the questions I had upon watching Clue, the cinematic event, a couple of weeks ago. That's a Clue joke for the Clue fans out there. I've yet to play the board game, but the movie was phenomenal. Love Tim Curry. These are also questions that we unofficially address on this pod on a near weekly basis. I think we talk a lot about who in the way of persona-based strategies, the 4Cs, my own secret weapon from the world of political strategy, which is the message box. We also often chat about the overall customer journey. So where is someone? That's when we're talking about top of funnel content versus middle and bottom of funnel content versus post-click versus retention. All of this stuff tends to sort of make up the bulk of the when conversation. But where? I realized upon watching Clue and thinking about how the game of Clue functions, that on this podcast, we seldom talk about where. I've been neglecting where a little bit, but I think it's very important. We'll sometimes talk about where in the context of organic versus paid, but I really wanted to talk about where in the full paid context, and I wanted to really go into some details for you guys, because when I was, sort of starting out a few years ago, I feel like this information would have been really helpful. So whether you are operating a brand from a creative strategist point of view, or if you founded a brand and you're sort of bootstrapping and testing out different things for yourself, this 2-episode run hopefully will be really helpful in understanding something that people don't often take the time to explain. So we're going to talk about platforms over these next 2 episodes. Today, I'm going to talk about platforms and what type of content tends to do well there from an angle point of view. And we're going to mostly focus on sort of top of funnel social channels. So we're going to exclude the marketplaces like Amazon or TikTok Shop because they are different than the rest of the platforms we're going to talk about today. They're very different in terms of what content works there. So I want to make sure to give them their time in the sun later on with more specific episodes. Again, it's much different in those marketplace settings like Amazon or TikTok Shop compared to, feed-based paid media like the platforms we're going to talk about today. So like I said, we'll talk about those later. They're just a little bit specific to be grouped in with these guys. So today I actually want to highlight, like I mentioned, the sort of user intent of using these platforms, because like I mentioned, these are things that we often don't talk about. We assume everyone knows as marketers, but you really don't know these things. I want to talk today about the intent that people have when they go on these platforms. And then next week, we're going to talk about really technical details, like what type of specs to include when you're prepping content for these platforms, as well as what type of demographics live on these platforms. Those 2 points, I think, again, really important. In terms of specs, I love to kind of nerd out about optimizing content for platforms in terms of both size, text size, all of that stuff is actually really important. Ad copy as well. All these things very important to fine tune your content. So like I said, today we're going to go kind of big overview, talk about what type of content from an angle and concept perspective works on these platforms. And then next week we'll get really nerdy, really technical. We'll talk about safe zones, all that good stuff. So like I mentioned, we're leaving the marketplaces out of it. So today we're going to talk about Meta, Pinterest, Snapchat, TikTok, and Axon, formerly known as AppLovin, which is in mobile game placements. I do actively produce content for all of these platforms and a couple of others. And I think from my tenured experience in working with a large multitude of platforms, I think the number one thing to remember is that often there are more similarities between platforms than there are differences when it comes to concepts and angles. And so a lot of the times when I talk to folks who are also working as creative strategists, and I say that I am, working against all of these platforms, they often act like that is a much bigger feat than it really is. I think what is really helpful before we get into the specifics of Meta, Instagram, Pinterest, Snapchat, TikTok, Axon, before we get into the specifics, what is really important to remember to safeguard your own sanity is there are more similarities than there are differences. And the way that you should approach platform expansion is you should always think about it in terms of carrying over learnings from platforms that you know very well into these new spaces and making sure that you're not just starting fresh and trying to too heavily emulate what's going on an organic sense on these platforms. So let's get into it. We're going to start with Meta. And we're going to break up Meta and Instagram because I do think that's important. I break up Meta and Instagram when I am looking at content performance. Like I mentioned, they're fundamentally different. We'll talk about audiences next week, but they're also different in the sort of layout of the app themselves, especially on mobile, and they're different in terms of what people expect. So let's talk about them separately for these next 2 episodes. I'm starting with Meta because it is numero uno. It is impossible to escape. It is the social network that started it all. I don't know. I don't want to give too much to Meta because I don't use it and I don't know anyone who does, but a lot of people do. And I know because I am on Meta selling them stuff. And what I want to talk about is the type of scrolling that happens on Meta because it's very interesting to me compared to, a TikTok or a Pinterest. Pinterest especially, there is intent and there's a lot of intention behind logging onto that platform. There is no intention behind logging into Meta. That is what I've learned from hours spent combing through Meta content and Meta comment sections. I have spent a lot of time on this platform, not as a user, but as an advertiser, and I can tell you little to no intent going on. And so what that means for you, as someone who is also an advertiser on the platform, is that you really have to think about the headspace someone is in when they open up their Meta app. Typically, it is to scroll Marketplace, it's to go on Messenger. Those are technically intent-based, but most of the time, it's probably waiting for the bus or sitting in a dentist's office waiting for your turn. It is sort of bottom of the barrel for a lot of people, or it is genuinely something people do on their desktop, which I still find fascinating. And they're not looking to discover anything on Meta. I think this is a very important takeaway here with this platform. When someone goes to scroll through, whether it is any type of vertical video content, if they're on their desktop, when we're scrolling Meta, we are not looking to necessarily discover something new. And so the trick there is you really want to know your audience when you are dependent on Meta. And I've talked about this on the podcast before. Meta is by far the best sort of research engine when it comes to testing concepts and testing personas. It's just the most sophisticated in the way that it serves content and delivers data back to us. And it's also just the most reliable. It's got a ton of users, but I think it's really important to note that they're not necessarily looking for anything new. When you think about someone going on, I'll use Pinterest again as an example. Typically, the person logging onto Pinterest wants to look up something like living room decor, spring outfits 2026. You know, they're going on with intense intent. That was really hard to say. Intense intent to discover something new. But Meta, we're just looking to scroll. And so, again, what's really important is to understand who you're talking to when you are advertising on Meta, so you understand the affinity-based plays you can make. This is a really hot tip. I'm not joking, guys. This is a really hot tip. It's something that I'm actively injecting more and more of in my work, which is making a play for affinity and engagement on Meta specifically, and using sort of cultural references and relevant content to your target personas to generate a ton of engagement, which further helps Meta deliver the ads to people who like the ads, which tends to be people who click on the ads and buy things based on the ads. And so really making a play for we're not swinging for the absolute fences. We're not bringing this like net new incredible product to Meta. We're not bringing a net new creative style. We're not breaking the boundaries. We're instead noting the boundaries on Meta, watching them diligently and figuring out how to create content that is engaging and affinity forward rather than a really big sell at the top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel. Doesn't matter where you are on Meta. That is sort of the name of the game. Moving on, let's talk about Instagram placements a little bit, because Instagram placements are really important and I oftentimes see them get overlooked. Something we have tested here on the Pilot House side is content exclusively for Instagram. So I'll talk a little bit about that more next week in terms of sizing. But something that I really want to note is a kind of spoiler. The main differences between Meta and Instagram tend to come from audiences. And I want to call out that Meta and Instagram are more similar now than they used to be. So Instagram exists in sort of the same way. I think there's a very funny joke that if you see something funny on Reels, that it was probably funny on TikTok weeks ago. And so Instagram for me, this is kind of mean, but I like to think of Meta as like my Gen X boomer bestie. And IG is definitely my really cool, really kind millennial friend at this point. And I want to especially call out, there is a lot of ground to be gained by focusing on real content specifically for Instagram. Typically, this content works on Meta as well, but the type of angle that tends to work in Instagram Reels tends to be that, like I just said, kind of funny, short form TikTok style content. And while I mentioned there's jokes, it takes them a while to sort of catch up. That is the type of experience that the average Instagram Reel user is looking for. They're looking for something shareable. They're looking for something funny. They're looking for something quick. And so thinking hard about, the difference between a longer form asset that might perform on Meta versus shorter form, punchier content for Instagram Reels can really make a difference in your content lineup and in the performance of that content by just paying attention to, again, what people expect from these two different platforms. So I'd really recommend, like I mentioned, trying to think of those like punchier angles and really shareable content for Instagram, and content that feels less of a heavy sell. So similar to Meta in that way. Like I said, there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. Similar to Meta in that way, but also just think about, again, the experience of scrolling through Reels versus the experience of scrolling on your desktop. You want a fast Reel that provides entertainment quickly, whereas if you're scrolling desktop, which it blows my mind every time I'm looking at like placement intel on performance in an ad account, the number sometimes of people shopping an ad on their feed is like their desktop feed. Insane to me. Love it. But yeah, there's so many similarities, but that is like one core difference to think about, just the experience of someone scrolling on their desktop, looking at, maybe the affinity part of the video catches their eye, and then they're most likely going to be more willing to sit around and watch a longer form video. Whereas on Instagram Reels, you want something fast, you want something punchy. that's just how you're scrolling that platform. Let's move on to one that people love to hate, but I love. I also have to say, I'm not being paid, but every single Snapchat rep I have ever spoken to has been one of the loveliest people in the world. I do want to say as well, because sometimes they do listen, my current meta rep is a dream. Love working with him. But Snapchat reps have just been so pleasant to work with time and time again. It's a really interesting platform that I think a lot of people don't pay attention to because it's Snapchat. I feel like when I started seeing results from Snap campaigns, I was a little bit flabbergasted. Yeah, I don't want to get too into, I guess, the lore of Snapchat, but Snapchat is a really interesting place. I know a lot of content creators slash sort of influencers use Snapchat in a very different way. They're posting sort of constantly, and it's a really good way for them to, insert brand deal type of content. But I want to talk about the type of content and angles that work from an ads perspective. So like I mentioned, I'm going to keep saying this, there are a lot of similarities between a lot of these platforms, and a way to not get overwhelmed is to remember them and map them out. So for me, Snapchat functions very similar to Instagram Reels. The type of content that works for me on Reels tends to work on Snapchat. That being vertical video content that is typically iPhone shot and does a really quick job of explaining what a product is and why. I will say on Reels, I tend to see more humor-based content, sort of skits, stuff of that nature, work better at scale. On Snapchat, what tends to work at scale is product-focused, but very quick cuts, very scrappy organic editing styles. And again, really think about the user. This is very funny for me to say. Really think about the user, the average user of Snapchat. They tend to be in that sort of millennial pocket, and scrolling through Snapchat is a whole different beast. You're usually looking at things like, I don't know if I'm kind of outing myself with this, but celebrity gossip, again, influencers. It's a really unique way to absorb digital media from my point of view, like just scrolling on Snap, really funny, and clicking through. But again, I have seen some fruit from the Snapchat tree, so don't write it off. Just remember, again, vertical video content. If you've got a creator program and you've got affiliate content, Snapchat is a great place to put that affiliate content and just test very organic vertical styles. You do want it to be, like I mentioned, a little bit more product focused than your average reel, which is why I'm sort of suggesting this route of taking your affiliate content, plugging it into Snapchat and seeing where that gets you. It tends to, like I mentioned, work well if you've got like multiple styles. Something I will also mention with Snap is you really want to think about what product you're pushing there. So if you are my make-believe coffee cup company, I would most likely go with my make-believe travel mugs instead of my make-believe espresso machine. What I've seen, and this is just my experience so far, what I've seen is it's a lot easier to quickly gain traction on Snapchat with products that are really purchasable in a single session. It is great as well, I will say, for promos and sales. It's great for bringing people in at the top of funnel. And it's also great if you are okay with spending into reach. So I know that kind of directly contradicts what I just said, but I am under the assumption a lot of folks listening to this ad are very performance focused. But if you are a larger brand and you're willing to invest in reach, Snapchat is also a great option for that. Depending again on your product and your audience, of course, but you can also just get a lot of eyeballs on your ads if that's your thing. I would say YouTube Shorts is sort of similar, where if you're just looking to reach new people, these are platforms that are great for that. Next, we're going to move on to TikTok, everyone's favorite. I mentioned at the top, we're not going to be talking about TikTok shop content. We're not talking about GMVs. We're not talking about Creator Marketplace. We're not talking about any of that affiliate stuff. I want to talk about traditional TikTok ads, which is weird to say because it hasn't been around for that long. So calling it traditional is kind of funny to me. And it's also TikTok, which is also just always funny. But I did want to mention TikTok, quote unquote, traditional, because there is still a place for it. TikTok Shop is obviously providing a lot of growth for a lot of brands, something that we work with here at Pilot House, seeing really wonderful results from TikTok Shop. But there's also some brands who are still seeing great results from like TikTok Classic, just paid ads that we're running. So I want to talk about the type of content and the type of, mindset like we've been doing on these platforms. So TikTok, like I mentioned with Reels, is really the place for fun, entertaining content. As we mentioned with Pinterest, people go onto Pinterest with intense intent. People log into TikTok with a similar intense intent, but that is to be entertained. They want to have a good time and they don't want to necessarily shop. Again, we'll talk about TikTok Shop later. They don't want to necessarily shop, but they would love to be introduced to something that they would like to purchase. And so TikTok for me has always been really fun and really interesting to create content for because, sometimes you can create really sort of viral, high engagement moments that don't actually produce a whole lot of conversions. That has happened to me. And then you can also create really boring, lame content that drives a ton of conversions. And so I guess you have to be happy about that because it is working and performing. But TikTok, like I mentioned, it's really interesting in that the intent that people have is to be entertained, to just doom scroll and kind of forget their worries and in a lot of ways be introduced to something new, but they want to feel like they've stumbled upon it. And I think that is my biggest takeaway after advertising on the platform for quite a few years now. You can't be too ham-fisted with the folks on TikTok. To advertise well on TikTok requires a deep knowledge of the platform. Now I'm just like bragging about high screen time, I guess. But it does require a really deep knowledge of the platform. And you have to really understand how to finesse, shout out Bruno Mars and Cardi B, and add to make it feel organic. And like I mentioned, make it feel like someone is stumbling into this new thing rather than it being sort of shoved down their throat through an ad. Something I will suggest as well, I'll get into more of these types of tips next week. Sometimes I feel like what happens too is I just like something feels so important I have to say it. With TikTok, something that I have seen work very well, it's more tactical, is taking things from your organic channels and then simply promoting them when they do well. It de-risks producing a lot of content, and TikTok does like a lot of content. That is not something we want to shy away from. We'll talk about it more next week. But something I've been really experimenting with is promoting content from different accounts as well, which has proven fruitful and I would recommend trying. So whether that is like a quote unquote personal account, creating an account of the founder and then promoting content from that account versus promoting content from your branded account. There's a lot of options on TikTok that are not TikTok Shop that people tend to forget about, but it's a great platform for both performance and reach at the same time, which is pretty rare. So don't go into it thinking that you can just look up trending audios, make content with that trending audio, and you will see performance. There's a lot of nuance to it. And like I said, you have to be entertaining and also have to be very low key in the way that you present your product. Next, we're going to talk about Axon, formerly known as AppLovin. A big sigh because this is a real true story. This happened to me, Aves. I once went from spending no money on this platform to spending $500,000 in a singular month. And it was a really hard month for me as someone who creates content. The trick with Axon is, and for some background, if you're not familiar, because it is a little bit newer, and when I was exponentially scaling this platform, we were in a beta test, a closed beta test, but it's, I believe, pretty open now. It is in platform mobile game or mobile app placements. So I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about my iPad. I wasn't going to. I didn't prep notes for this, but it's like when you're playing a game on your iPad and then you get one of those 30-second unskippable ads. That is this. Oh my goodness. A dream, right? All the time. Every episode I'm going, oh guys, it really sucks. There's only 3 to 5 seconds that you have someone's attention for, and then they scroll. And now you have them for 30 seconds. Incroyable. Sadly, this is what I learned, and this is why I look back on that month of my life with trepidation and fear in my heart. 30 seconds is a long time. It's a very long time. And what I didn't want to do, and I still don't want to do when I'm working with this platform, is simply take content from Meta, say, and repurpose it and toss it in there because it happens to be over 30 seconds and it's long enough to run on the platform. Because I often work off the assumption that people are watching that content halfway through, or they are watching that content on 2-3x speed. And with Axon and AppLovin, I realized that I had a real opportunity to be in front of people in a different capacity. So you want to make sure that you are, again, thinking about the mindset of someone. And this is not hard for me to do because I have multiple iPad games that I play on a daily basis. I run a cat farm. I also run a cat cafe. And I have this puzzle game that I prefer not to disclose because it's very embarrassing. But anyway, when you are playing games on your iPad or your phone, you are in a different rhythm than someone who is even scrolling Meta because you're there to just relax, you know? You're there to play Words with Friends, and you also, really interestingly enough, understand that there are going to be ads. This was something that took me sort of a couple months to really get my feet under me, but a lot of other places, I think we'll do a separate episode about YouTube as well, because it is like a bigger fish to fry. But a lot of other platforms, there's typically a much sooner opportunity to skip an ad. And with a mobile game and a mobile gamer as I am, what's very interesting is that 30 seconds is, long enough to put some pressure on me, the advertiser, but it's also, as the person receiving the ad, it's not quite long enough to walk away from my device. You might pick up another device or start watching TV, but you're not going to give up on playing the game, or you're not going to walk away and do something else. I think I made the comparison to YouTube because I think what often happens is if you've got like a 31-minute unskippable ad on YouTube, people will just, get up and do the dishes or I don't know, do something else while that ad is happening, because watching YouTube is already a passive experience where if you are locked in, you got your Apple Pencil and you're playing your game, you are actively doing something on that platform. And so people tend to watch the ads more. That was a very long-winded way of saying people tend to watch the 30 seconds compared to other platforms with unskippable ads. And so what's really interesting about that is how you are storyboarding your concepts. And storyboarding concepts is sort of, I think, in a way, a lost art form because like I mentioned before, typically you have 3 to 5 seconds to get someone's attention. And so you're always just like pulling stunts like a young drag queen at the beginning of your content, where with Axon, you really want to make sure that you are lacing value into every shot. And so something I've seen work quite well on this platform is sale content, interestingly enough. So when we are having some kind of promotion or sale, leaning into advertising on this platform and doing so through content that is super simple but visually stimulating. So what I mean by that is very simple overlays, and then we add different shots of different products that are included in the sale or something of that nature. So it keeps the person looking at the screen. You're showing the coffee cup, the espresso machine, you're showing like a multitude of products. Very quick shots is what tends to work, so that again, you're keeping that person visually engaged with an overlay that's just talking about the sale. Another thing that I see work on the evergreen front is very thoughtful creator-led content that is obviously 30 seconds or longer. And so what I mean by thoughtful is it's not like sometimes I do just make content that I think is like funny and stupid and weird. It's thoughtful and intentful in the way of sort of each line should be specifically spelled out. And you want to make sure that you are adding a reason to watch with sort of every scene. that you storyboard out. And so what I mean by that is you can still have a fun kind of gimmicky hook, but you want to be adding on layers of value as the video progresses, because you don't want to lose their attention, even though they might still be technically physically looking at the ad. You want to keep them actually invested, which is why you have to just take a lot more time and care and make sure that sort of every beat of that 30 seconds makes sense, adds value, and is entertaining, which trust me, I know is difficult. Like I mentioned, crazy scale within 1 month. It like broke my brain to think about long form ads like that after so long of thinking about ads in these 3 to 5 second chunks. But again, once I really got my feet under me and I started to understand, okay, these people are actively participating in their device. They're playing a game, they're doing whatever they're doing, and then I show up with this ad. How do I make the most of that attention? Because it is much more legitimate than, say, YouTube or anywhere else where there's unskippable ads. So really, again, making sure that you're lacing every beat of the content with value. That was a sort of long rundown on each of those platforms, and just how I think about content and how I've unlocked success from a sort of content type point of view. Like I mentioned, next week, we are going to talk about specs. We're going to talk about, safe zones. And we're also going to talk about demographics, so who tends to live on these platforms, which sort of laces into this idea of what type of content works. Kind of spoiler alert. One thing I do want to say as well is something that I have seen time and time again is there's no middle ground when it comes to media mix, which is what I've found. People are either too ambitious with the amount of platforms that they want to take on, or people are not ambitious enough. If you are someone who is overly ambitious about the amount of platforms you want to take on, I would first ask you, have you really perfected your meta program? Does it crank at scale? Is it hyper efficient? And do you know exactly who your target personas are? And are you consistently making content that resonates with them? If not, you might not want to bring on like 3 to 4 other platforms. It might make sense sometimes to bring on one other one to support, especially if you've got sort of a strong meta foundation there and you want to bring on Pinterest ahead of a big launch or something like that. There are times and places to start to mix in different platforms, but I would err on the side of caution always, especially if you're a bit newer. And if you are someone who is hesitant to bring on new platforms, but you have really perfected, your meta program, maybe your retention program is really strong as well, your site is great, I will say that it is important these days, more so than ever, to consistently show up. We've been talking a lot about the idea of an omnipresent brand, and you can only be omnipresent if you are everywhere by definition. And so to truly win, and I'm talking to brands who, you're in that sort of 25 to 50 mil rev band, you need to be actively thinking about what platforms you're on and how to expand them quickly, because you need to, if you haven't done the work to find your sort of 3 hero platforms, you are definitely leaving money, eyeballs, and also potentially loyal customers on the table. So it's really important to understand that different people, and we'll talk about this more next week, different people live on different platforms on the internet, right? Take me, for example. I don't know what's going on Meta. I don't even know what's going on Instagram. I haven't used that platform in like 10 years, but I do be on Pinterest like crazy, and TikTok as well. So what's really important to do is to take a step back, look at your marketing plan, look at your marketing spend, look at your main personas, figure out where they live, and then make sure that you are adequately advertising on those platforms. Because if not, again, you might be missing some really core people in your audience just because you're a little bit gun shy and not sure how to make content. So hopefully that was helpful. I know from experience, like it's very overwhelming to create content for a multitude of different platforms on a weekly basis. The way that I do it, again, is looking for patterns in the performance and similarities so that I can, go to a creator and get a slightly different asset that's going to work on Axon versus Meta. That kind of thing makes the workflow a lot simpler once you can see those patterns in your own performance. One thing I will mention as well, on the note of media mix, it's something that, like I mentioned, is really hard to get your head wrapped around and to know when the best time to bring on new platforms is, especially, at any stage of your journey, actually, as a business. And so if you're looking for a second set of eyes to really help you start that work of figuring out, is this the right time to expand platforms, and what platforms should I even be looking at? It's all good. You can reach out on LinkedIn, Aves, Valerio. You can also go to the Pilot House website and fill out a lead form. And if you say you came from the Ad-venturous podcast, we can chat directly. And I'll also, bring a colleague who's a little bit more well-versed, because I love to make fun content and I know exactly what content to make on what platform. But we've got an entire team of very tenured e-commerce strategists who live and breathe that question of, what media do I mix in and when? And they are truly phenomenal. And working with them this is so nerdy. I hope none of them listen to this. Working with them is like truly the pleasure of my life. One of my closest coworkers, like the knowledge that he is constantly looking at platform performance from a media mix point of view, while I can look at it from a content mix on platforms point of view, it helps me genuinely sleep better at night and know that the work we're doing is actually building scalable growth for brands. So if you want to chat, reach out on LinkedIn or to the Pilot House website. I'd love to talk. I love to talk about this stuff. I will save everything else for next week, where, like I mentioned, we will talk about demographics on these platforms, and we will also talk about specs and more technical ad details, which I am really, really excited for. Thanks so much for listening. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, even outside of the media mix, if you want to talk about different platforms, feel free to reach out with anything, and I will talk to you guys next week.